On the 27th of October 1910, William Thomas Blackmore, a naval pensioner, married Kathleen Smith in the Mariners Church, Kingstown, County Dublin.
Their children, Sophia, Edwin and Charles, were christened there in 1912, 1913 and 1915.
On the 8th of March 1922, Richard Best, an engineer, married Evelyn Margaret Dormer in the Mariners Church, Dun Laoghaire.
Their children, Francis and Maureen, were christened there in 1923 and 1931.
A brief snapshot of the lives of those parishioners at a County Dublin church in the early 1900s.
On the 14th of September 1919, John Rowland Crossley, a sergeant major, married Ethel Mary Knight in the Mariners Church, Kingstown, County Dublin.
Their children, William and Elizabeth, were christened there in 1929 and 1932.
On the 19th of October 1921, George Oswald Dormer, a contractor, married Luigia Maria Vincenza Avondella in the Mariners Church in Dun Laoghaire, County Dublin.
Their child, Italia, was christened in the Mariners Church in 1922.
They had to call the child Italia, obviously. Canon George Chamberlain was rector of this church from 1925 until the mid-1960s, and he and his family lived right next door. The Mariners Church closed in the 1970s, its flock scattered, and it's now home to the Mariners Museum. Canon Chamberlain's granddaughter is writer Julie Parsons, who's been on a mission to find out what became of the parishioners of the Mariners. And Julie joins me now. You're very welcome indeed.
Thanks.
For anybody who might know Dun Laoghaire, tell us first of all, where is the Mariners, now the Mariners Museum? What was the Mariners Church?
It's actually on Adelaide Street, which is, if you go along Georgia Street, which is the main street of Dun Laoghaire, and you turn down to the left, or you can approach it from the Royal Marine Hotel. It's very striking. It has a spire that's as tall as the spire of St Michael's Church in Dun Laoghaire. It sits there above the harbour, very impressive. And I mean, I think anybody who's even, in fact, when you come in, for those of us who are old enough to remember coming in on the mailboat, it was one of the first things you'd see would be the spire of the Mariners.
The spire of them, yeah, obviously. What started you on this task?
Well, my mother, Elizabeth, was one of the canon's youngest daughter, and she grew up in the rectory next door to the church. And her life, really until she was 18 and 19 when she left home and went off to the Second World War, which is another story, her life revolved around the parish and the church and the doings of the parish. And I was born and brought up in New Zealand, and when we were children, she used to tell us all the stories about the Mariners and the fact that she had to go to church 3 times a day and all that sort of thing, and all the kind of weird and wonderful things that the parishioners got up to. But I sort of wasn't particularly interested, and, I grew up and lived my own life and didn't really care that much. But in the latter years, my mother, when she got into her late 80s, went into a nursing home, and because I'm the only one of the family who live here, I spent a lot of time with her. I used to take her out, take her for drives, and of course, as people of her age do, she wanted to talk about the old days, and she was always talking about home, and home for her was the rectory in Adelaide Street. So I started to think about it, and I began to wonder what had happened to all the parishioners. And I think we all know it's a truism that the Church of Ireland population of the Republic, shot downwards after independence, and particularly that part of Dublin. I mean, if you know that there's the coastal strip, you'll know that there's All Saints Church in Blackrock, there's Monkstown Parish Church, there's St John's in Mounttown, which is now where the Tridentine Masses are held. Was the Mariners, there's Christ Church in Dun Laoghaire, St Paul's in Glenageary, St Patrick's in Dalkey. Huge big churches, and now they have absolutely tiny parishes. So I decided I'd see if I could find out what had happened. So first of all, I wanted to define what was, for me, a Mariners parishioner. So I went to the Church of Ireland Library in Churchtown. I went through the marriage registers and the baptismal registers, copied them all out because you're not allowed to photocopy them, and then I cross-referenced, and I found 48 families where the parents had gotten married in the Mariners and their children had subsequently been baptised there. And these are my Mariners families, my 48 families, and it is my aim to track them all down. So that's how I started it.
That's where the detective work started.
Exactly.
So 48. So this is your sample, basically.
It is.
These are your Mariners.
These are my Mariners people, my Mariners families.
And then how did you begin to try and contact either these people themselves or more likely their descendants?
Well, I'm not a historian. I have written a number of thrillers. I probably would be more of a private detective than a historian. So I did a very obvious thing. I picked up the Dublin phone book, I flicked through it, and anywhere where I found the same name and there were 10 or fewer people, I wrote to them.
And it's interesting because the names are quite unusual. They are, let's face it, they are very Protestant names.
They are very, very unusual. I mean, let's just look at it here. Anderson, Archibald, Armstrong, Beers, Blackmore, Best, Barnett. I mean, those are just the B's,
Crossley, Dormer, Hamlet, Kitchen.
Exactly, yes.
There will be relatively few of them in the phone book.
There would be relatively few. There are some like Moore, Farrell, Higgins, where there were lots, and I just ignored them because I couldn't send out that many letters. So I sent off my letters and I said, "Dear, whatever your name is," and explained what I was doing. And I said, "Are you related in any way to?" And I gave the name of the parents and the name of the children. And I got tons and tons and tons of replies. I was completely flabbergasted. I got phone calls, emails, text messages, letters. Most of the people were not related to them, even though they had the same names, but they were all intrigued by what I was doing, and I got lots of very funny stories and lots of interesting anecdotes. But I also got 5 of my families.
5?
Through the phone book I found Joseph Mitchellburn and Adelaide Anna Sims. I found Arthur and Annie Senior. I found Claude and Mary Glansford. I found Reginald and Evangeline Stanford. And I found Richard and Evelyn Best. Now, of course, I didn't find them because they're all unfortunately dead. But I found a nephew, a grandson, a daughter-in-law, a daughter, and another daughter. So, for me, I thought that was a pretty good way to start.
So you've got 5, you've got 43 left. You began then, I think, to ask around. You asked people who might be able to put you in contact.
I did. I asked around. I got used. Every time I went out, I'd carry the list with me, and anybody who I thought might know, I'd thrust it into their hands. And again, from asking around, I discovered I found 11 more through asking around. And I think what I found was I found the people who still live in the greater Dun Laoghaire area, and what I also found as well was the Mariners had a school attached to it, a co-ed school that went up to the age of 14. Now, I had initially thought that it was a primary school, but in fact it wasn't. It went up to the age of 14, which was when kids could legally leave school. And I found a group of women who all went to the Mariners school. And they still meet. They're all mostly in their 70s. They meet every week and they play bingo and they're great fun. And they were all in the Girls' Brigade, which is the kind of Church of Ireland version of the Scouts. And these are people who were married, actually, to men in my sample. So I found them and I talked to them about their lives and I talked to them about what had happened to their relations. And through them, I found more and more. So I eventually found myself up to the stage where I had 11 more. Now, I reckon by that stage I'd probably, got as many as I could just by going out and being nosy. So I spoke to an archivist friend of mine, Kevin Lowen, and I asked him what he would recommend. And he recommended a number of things. The Irish Times Archive. He also said that wills are registered in the National Archive.
Irish Times Archives for births, marriages and deaths.
And anything else you might come across. He said you will be amazed at what you will find in the Irish Times Archive. Wills
because it's searchable.
So completely and utterly. Yeah. Now, you have to pay is the only thing. But, you can sign up for a month and you'll probably do everything you're going to do. So I sat down in front of the Irish Times Archive and I put in my names and I was amazed at the stuff that came up. Little things like a man called William Beers, who was in a dance class when he was obviously a teenager, and he was in a recital in Dun Laoghaire, and he did a splendid example of the tango. All kinds of little things. You get. They used to publish as well the names of the people who came and went on the mailboat. So I could find, in fact, Mr. and Mrs. Beers went to England a number of times. I actually found a really sweet one, a man called John Rowland, who was, I think he was in the Royal Navy, and he lived in Wales. He got married in 1911, okay? And 22nd of December 1910, he was caught getting the boat from Anglesey to Dun Laoghaire without a ticket and was summoned for it. And I could completely imagine him, John Rowlands, who got married to Elizabeth in October 1911. I could completely see him wanting to come over and see her for Christmas,
And so, you also, the Hamlet family.
I did.
Yes. Did you get them through the
I got
Irish
them
Times
through the Irish Times as well. One of my families was George Thomas, who married George Thomas and Elizabeth Hamlet, and they had a son also called George. And it turns out from my researching in the Irish Times that George was the most amazing rugby player. He was capped 30 times for Ireland. He was also in the Royal Dublin Fusiliers. And one of the things that I found was he worked in Broadstone in the railway station. And in 1915, when he left to go off to war, there was a presentation made for him. So I obviously could see that he had been, in the army. I then subsequently discovered that his son, George Aylmer Hamlet, was also very involved in rugby. In fact, was one of the I think he was called the father of the club, of Sligo Rugby Club. And George was in the Second World War, and he was in the Battle of Suda Bay, which was a huge defeat for the Allies. And George and thousands of other Allied soldiers were trapped by the Germans in Crete. And George spent 4 years in German prisoner of war camps. So he was another one of my Irish Times successes.
Okay, tell us about some of the other families you found, the Monsels.
Okay, well, the Monsels, I'm intrigued by the Monsels because they do have the most wonderful names. Clarendon Monsell, who was married to Muriel Monsell, and they lived in number 1 Mulgrave Terrace in Dun Laoghaire, and I actually, as it happens, know someone who lives in that same house. So whenever I go to the house, I feel I'm walking the steps of the Monsells. They had 4 children, Clarendon Jr., William, Fortescue Brent, and Muriel, okay?
Great names.
Now, okay, Monsells in the phone book, not related. However, through the Irish Times, I discovered that both Clarendon and Fortescue had won prizes for riddle competitions in 1925. Okay, fascinating, doesn't get me anywhere. In the meantime, my very nice son-in-law did me up a website. You know the way people do that for us older folks who don't know how to do it. And suddenly, out of the blue, I got an email from a lady in England called Linda Frost, who is related to the Monsells in some other way, tangentially. So we started corresponding, sharing whatever information we had. And the next thing she tells me that Muriel, okay, who was born in 1916, she got her death notice. She died in Frimpton in Essex on the 23rd of February last year. Okay, now the death notice said, wonderful aunt and great aunt. So I'm presuming that Muriel didn't have children, but I got in touch. I got a phone number for the church in Essex. I spoke to the clergyman, the minister, because it's a Baptist church, and he is going to see if he can find any of her relations there. So that's another thing. Another thing with the Pemberton family.
The Pembertons.
The Pembertons.
Right.
Harry and Dora and their children, Harry, Aubrey, and Dora Jr., okay? So through the Irish Times, I discovered that Dora, in 1923, was in a production of Northanger Abbey in Alexandra College in Dublin. So I went along to Alex, spoke to the very nice librarian there, and she let me look at the Guild. The Old Girls Association in Alex is called the Guild, and I looked at all the magazines. And through that, I discovered Dora was a very clever girl. She was always winning prizes and scholarships. But in 1927, she got a job as a mistress in St Andrews College, which is another very well-known school here. Again, got on to St Andrews and discovered that, unfortunately, Dora died in 1936.
Also, James Philip Kitchen, finally, who
yes.
He was described as a journalist, although you were a bit dubious about
I was. In the 1930s, he was described as a journalist. I honestly didn't think that, there were such things. Anyway, James got married to a lady with the lovely name of Palmyra, and they had a son, William. So I hadn't, in my asking arounds, been able to find anything about him. But through the Irish Times, I actually found out quite a lot about him. He was in the Irish Army, actually, and I found his obituary. But I also found something that was interesting. He had been a sub-editor for the Irish Press for 20 years. Now, I, in my slightly, I don't know whether you want to call it, narrow-minded view, had assumed that as a Church of Ireland journalist, he probably would have worked for the Irish Times. And I wrote to Geraldine Kennedy and asked her if she would mind looking up her employment records, which somebody did and wrote back to me and said, no, James Kitchen hadn't worked there, but in fact had worked for the Irish Press. So I haven't yet followed that up, but that's an example of something else I can follow up.
Interesting when you do follow it up. And a poll rings in to say you don't have to pay for the Irish Times archive if you access it through your local library. Obviously, if you want to do it from home,
yes.
You will have to pay.
But I suppose really the reason really, Miles, why I was so keen to come on your show, because I'm sure that you have lots of people who listen via the internet, and I'm really interested in a way in the ones that I haven't found, the people I found nothing about.
And people can actually go on your website and they can check out the names and they can see, well, maybe I'm associated with one of those
and
names.
I mean, I'm assuming, obviously, hundreds of thousands of Irish people emigrated. And obviously, a lot of these people would have emigrated, maybe for the same reasons that their fellow countrymen emigrated to get a job, whatever, or maybe because after independence they didn't feel comfortable. When the crown gave way to the heart, maybe they just didn't feel it was home any longer. So I really want to find their stories.
And you've got 18 families so far. The aim is to find all 48.
That's
so
it, yes.
a mere 30 to go. And the website is www.julieparsons, Parsons, julieparsons.com. It's also up on our RTE website. It's also up, the names, that is, are up on Irish History, www.irishhistory.ie. So the best of luck with it. Hopefully people listening will go on the website, will go on your website or our website and have a look at the names and see, do they know any of them, do they recognise any of them, and you may find some more of the families, some more of the 48 families. Julie, thank you very much indeed.